There was a point in my life where I couldn't make even relatively small decisions without polling half the people around me. And I'm not just talking about major life decisions. I'm talking about things that objectively did not matter. Like, should I get the harvest salad or the Caesar salad? Should I buy this dress in blue or purple? Should I take this workout class? Should I go to that restaurant? And then, of course, there were also the bigger decisions. Should I take this job? Should I move to that city? Should I continue being friends with this person? But the funny thing is that the more opinions I collected, the less clear I felt. You would think that asking 10 people for advice would make a decision easier. Instead, it somehow made every decision feel heavier. And what was especially ridiculous is that I often didn't even follow the advice that people gave me. So I'd spend days collecting opinions, weighing options, overthinking everything, and then ultimately make a completely different decision anyway. Which begs the question, what exactly was I hoping to get out of all those conversations? Because looking back, I don't think I was actually looking for people to make decisions on my behalf. I think I was searching for permission. Permission to choose what I wanted, permission to disappoint people, permission to make a mistake, permission to trust myself. Because if I made a decision entirely on my own and it went badly, then I had nobody else to blame. And that's a really scary feeling. So instead, I outsourced the decision-making process. Maybe to distance myself from the consequences, maybe to reassure myself I was doing the right thing, maybe because I trusted everyone else's judgment more than my own. And today, I want to dig into what led me there, why I felt that way, and how I slowly learned to start owning my decisions. One thing that made me extremely careful about decision making is that mistakes felt expensive. And I think I was conditioned to feel that way from a pretty young age. I grew up in a household that valued cleanliness, order, discipline, and doing things the proper way. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of benefits to structure and rules. But as a kid, it sometimes felt like if something went wrong, privileges disappeared. Or at the very least, there would be a lecture. For example, one of my favorite childhood memories was having dinner with my mom and sister in the living room while watching Full House. My dad traveled a lot for work during the week, so it was usually just the three of us. We'd be in our pajamas, wrapped in blankets, eating dinner on colorful plates while watching TV together. And one night, my mom put out a big bowl of blueberries for us to share. My sister accidentally knocked the bowl over. Blueberries rolled everywhere, under the couch, under the TV stand, across the carpet. We cleaned up as many as we could find, but a few days later, when my dad came home from his work trip, he found a couple that we had missed. And after that, we weren't allowed to eat in the living room anymore. Another time, I met a girl at the park named Myra. This was before cell phones, so we agreed that we'd meet at the same park the following Friday at the same time. I was excited. I remember thinking about it all week. Then Friday came, I got dressed, I was ready to go. My dad and my sister were heading out with me when I accidentally slammed the back door. Not intentionally. You know when the wind catches it and pulls it shut? One of those moments. But my dad decided that because I slammed the door, I was no longer allowed to go to the park. So he and my sister went without me. And I remember sitting in my room for the rest of the day feeling devastated that I had lost the chance to meet up with my new friend. Looking back, I don't think either of these situations were really about blueberries or doors. What I internalized was that small mistakes could lead to surprisingly large consequences. And when you learn that lesson young enough, you start spending a lot of energy trying to avoid mistakes altogether. You become cautious, you overthink, you look for the correct answer. And eventually, I think I stopped asking myself what felt right to me and started asking what answer would get approval from the people around me. Another thing I've been ruminating on is the age when I first felt the need to fit in. And interestingly enough, it happened around the same time I became a teenager. Because when you're little, your family is your entire world. You assume most people live the way you do. Sure, I had the occasional playdate or park hangout growing up, but those interactions were usually only a couple of hours long. They weren't enough for me to realize how differently other families operated. But around age 13, my world got bigger. The school got bigger, the friend groups got bigger, the after-school activities became more social and less structured. Suddenly, I wasn't just seeing people in class anymore. I was getting pizza with friends after school, hanging out at people's houses, going to the movies with my friends and sometimes their older siblings, spending enough time around other families to notice that not everyone lived the way that I did. Suddenly, I wasn't just seeing people in class anymore. I was getting pizza with friends after school, hanging out at people's houses, going to the movies with my friends, and sometimes their older siblings, spending enough time around other families to notice that not everyone lived the way I did. And that's when I started becoming aware of social hierarchies. There were kids who seemed effortlessly liked, kids who seemed cool, kids who seemed to move through the world with a confidence that I did not have. And of course, I wanted to be part of that group. I remember becoming close friends with a girl in high school, let's call her Daisy, and spending time at Daisy's house felt like visiting another universe. We would make food together and she would make a huge mess while cooking. Not because she was careless, just because she wasn't worried about doing everything perfectly. And then she'd clean it up afterwards and move on with her life. I remember one time she dropped an egg on the floor while making French toast for us, and her mom laughed. Like, actually laughed. And I remember thinking how differently that situation would have been handled in my house. The same thing happened with socializing. Daisy would casually tell her parents, "Yeah, I'm going out tonight. I'll probably be home around 2." And they'd say, "Okay, have fun. See you at breakfast." And I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. Not because I wanted to stay out until 2 in the morning, but because she seemed so comfortable being herself. So naturally, I started wondering, will Daisy like my outfit? Will she think this is cool? Will people think I'm fun? Will they think I'm weird? And over time, the mindset spread far beyond Daisy. My attention became almost entirely outwards. I spent years learning how to read the room instead of learning how to read myself. And that's a dangerous trade-off. Because once your self-worth becomes dependent on other people's reactions, you're constantly at the mercy of things that you can't control. If someone doesn't like your outfit, if someone doesn't invite you somewhere, if someone is having a bad day and takes it out on you, or perhaps they barely notice you at all, and suddenly you're questioning yourself again. So while I thought I was becoming socially aware, what I was actually becoming was externally focused. And I think that's another reason I struggled so much with decision making later in life. Because I got very good at figuring out what everyone else wanted, but I never got very good at figuring out what I wanted. And just when I finally started feeling like I was fitting in socially towards the end of college, something unexpected happened. I started feeling the urge to differentiate myself, which is honestly kind of funny, because I had spent years trying to blend in, trying to be accepted, trying to be liked, trying to figure out the unwritten rules of whatever social environment I was in. And then one day, it felt like the goalposts moved. Suddenly, being different was cool. Having a unique perspective was cool. Having your own identity was cool. And I remember thinking, wait a second, I've spent all these years trying to figure out who everyone else wanted me to be. Who am I actually? And that question turned out to be much harder to answer than I expected. Because identity is complicated, especially when you sit at the intersection of a lot of different influences. For example, I'm American, I was born American, I grew up here, but I'm also Syrian. I speak Arabic, I spent summers in Damascus, I cook Syrian food at home. And those cultures don't always emphasize the same things. American culture tends to celebrate individuality. Middle Eastern culture often emphasizes family, community, and collective responsibility. So even something as simple as making a decision sometimes felt complicated. Am I supposed to prioritize myself or prioritize the people around me? Then there were other parts of my identity. I've always been athletic. I did cross country and tennis growing up, snowboarding in college, and now I run and do Pilates almost daily. But I've also loved very traditionally feminine things like dresses, purses, jewelry, makeup, and getting my hair done. And obviously those things can coexist. But growing up, they were often presented as very different archetypes, like in movies and pop culture, and the way people talked about tomboys and girly girls, and so on. And then there's the fact that I have a Syrian background, but I'm often perceived as white, which creates its own interesting experience. Some people see me as white, other people see me as ethnic, and depending on the environment, people project very different assumptions onto me. What I've realized looking back is that sitting at the intersection of multiple identities has eventually forced me to develop my own point of view, because there wasn't a single box I fit neatly into. And I think that for years that contributed to my decision-making struggles, because making decisions becomes very difficult when you don't fully understand your own values. If you're trying to satisfy 5 different versions of yourself at once, every choice feels complicated. Every option feels both right and wrong. And when that happens, it's very tempting to ask everyone else what they think instead. Another thought I've had is that maybe asking for advice gradually becomes a way for me to connect with people. Because when you ask someone for their opinion, you're implicitly telling them, I value what you think. And often it creates a bigger conversation. People tell stories, they explain their reasoning. You perhaps learn something about them. So maybe part of me wasn't just looking for advice, maybe I was looking for connection. But I can also see how that's a double-edged sword. Because if you ask 10 people for their opinion on the exact same issue, eventually some of them start wondering, why are you asking me if you're just going to ask 9 other people afterwards? And that is a very fair question. At some point, I started wondering whether all this polling and crowdsourcing was actually helping me at all. Because if I spend hours gathering opinions but still don't make a decision, was that time well spent? And that reminds me of a story. Sometimes my boyfriend and I order food delivery for dinner. Usually it's after a long day of work or after traveling when we're exhausted, hungry, and we just want something easy. And my boyfriend is incredibly easygoing. No dietary restrictions. He's open to trying different cuisines. Most of the time, he would just hand me his phone and say, pick whatever you want. And it should be the easiest decision in the world. But somehow I always turned it into a full research project. Because we live in Manhattan, and there are endless options. I would scroll through menus for absurd amounts of time, like 45 minutes, an hour, sometimes even longer. I'm comparing restaurants, comparing dishes, reading reviews, and occasionally I would spend so long trying to decide that I still wouldn't choose anything. And I could tell that over time, this process was starting to drive my boyfriend absolutely insane. Which, to be fair, he does have a point. It would drive anyone crazy. Like, I can picture us just sitting there, starving, while I scroll. And I am not proud to admit this, but one night I scrolled so long that most of the restaurants stopped accepting delivery orders, and we literally went to bed without eating. That is how ridiculous this had become. And at some point, my boyfriend mentioned this habit to one of his friends, and his friend responded, maybe she enjoys the process of deciding. And when my boyfriend told me that, I had a complete light bulb moment. Because somehow I had lost sight of the actual goal. The goal was not to find the perfect restaurant. The goal was to eat dinner. The goal was not to optimize every variable. The goal was to spend time with my boyfriend and enjoy a meal together. But instead, I had gotten trapped in this endless loop of hypothetical what ifs. What if I don't like what I order? What if my boyfriend doesn't like it? What if there's a better option one swipe away? What if I'm making the wrong choice? And suddenly I realized that all this overthinking wasn't protecting me from disappointment. It was actively preventing me from enjoying my life. I had become so focused on making the perfect decision that I stopped making decisions at all. And honestly, I don't even think this is just a me problem. I think modern life almost encourages decision paralysis because we have more options than any generation before us. Think about it. Like, actually think about it. If you want a restaurant recommendation, you don't ask your neighbor anymore. You can read 500 reviews. If you want career advice, you can watch 1,000 YouTube videos. If you want relationship advice, there are entire corners of the internet dedicated to telling you what to do. And on the surface, that sounds like a good thing. More information should help us make better decisions. But I've started wondering if there's a point where more information actually becomes counterproductive. Because eventually, you can consume so many opinions that you become disconnected from your own. Every decision turns into a rabbit hole. And maybe the outcome you're seeing online isn't even the outcome you'll experience yourself. Because life isn't a controlled experiment. People have different personalities, different values, different priorities, different circumstances. So there often isn't one universally correct answer. There may be several decisions that could lead to a fulfilling life. And I think that's the part I struggled with for a very long time. I was approaching decisions as though there was a perfect answer hidden somewhere. The perfect city, the perfect career, the perfect relationship, the perfect hobby. And if I just collected enough information, eventually I would find it. But I don't think it works that way. I think what we're really searching for is certainty. And certainty feels comforting because it creates the illusion that we can avoid regret, that we can somehow guarantee a good outcome. But most meaningful decisions don't come with guarantees. Sometimes you don't know whether a decision was right until years later. And sometimes the right decision isn't something you discover. It's something you create by committing to it, by investing in it, by building a life around it. And maybe that's the biggest thing I've learned. A fulfilling life probably isn't the result of one perfect decision. It's the accumulation of hundreds of imperfect decisions that gradually pull you in a direction you never could have predicted at the start. And I think that's what I was missing for so long. I kept assuming that somewhere out there was a person who knew the perfect answer. Someone who could tell me exactly what to do. someone who had already solved the problem. But most of the time, that person does not exist. And even if they did, they wouldn't have to live with the outcome. I would. So the real work became figuring out what mattered to me. What did I value? What kind of life was I trying to build? What did I actually want underneath all of the noise? Because once I started answering those questions, decisions became much clearer. Not easy, but clearer. And I think that's the distinction. For most of my life, I wasn't actually trying to make better decisions. I was trying to avoid the discomfort of owning them. Because if someone else told me what to do and things went badly, I could always point to their advice. But if I chose for myself, then I had to take responsibility for the outcome. And that felt terrifying. My closing thought is this: I don't think confidence comes from always making the right decision. I think confidence comes from trusting yourself enough to handle whatever happens after you've made a decision. Because life isn't built on one perfect choice. It's built on thousands of imperfect choices that slowly shape who you become. Okay, that's all I had for today. Thank you for listening. I'm Dina, and this is Casually Thriving.